Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim from a very warm Haifa in Israel. It's a pleasure to welcome you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. I do hope you can see me and hear me okay, given that I'm not at my usual station. Now, our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Jonathan Sandler. I'll introduce Jonathan in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. This is done by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we will do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility on your screen. You can use this to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, this event is being recorded. You'll find it on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next day or so. There you will also find details of our forthcoming programme and recordings of other past events. Now, to our guest this evening. By day, Jonathan Sandler is a project manager for a US software company. He's always had a passion for graphic novels, and he's recently published a book based on his grandfather's wartime experiences. He joins us from Golders Green. Jonathan, welcome to Milim. We're eagerly awaiting your presentation. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And thanks so much for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity tonight to talk about my grandfather's World War II experience and also my own personal journey in creating this, what I think is quite a unique graphic novel. Obviously, it's a particularly special evening tonight because I'm talking about one of the Leeds Jewish community's own sons in my grandfather, Bernard Sandler. As Jonathan said, I'm from Golders Green. I live here with my wife, Jenny, and my 3 kids. We live around the corner from Dunstan Road School. Some of you may know it. I have deep roots in the Leeds Jewish community. The Sandler family, with the Sandler family, my great grandmother, Celia Hurst, was born in Leeds in 1898. Her son Bernard was born in Leeds in 1922. My father, Michael Sandler, was born in Leeds in 1947. My aunt and uncle, Judy and Michael Rivlin, but still very much part of the Leeds Jewish community, and their son Eddie and his wife Carrie still also live in Leeds. I was here most recently for their son Benji's bar mitzvah. So that makes 5 generations of the family in Leeds so far. There's also a number of wider members of the Sandler and Hurst family that still live in Leeds. 2 years ago, if you had told me that tonight I would be sitting here talking about my first published book, I probably would not have believed you. But they say everyone has a book in them, and hopefully this tribute to my grandfather is just the beginning of my graphic memoir adventure. So I'm going to share my screen with you because I've got a presentation. And just do that. Is it coming up?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, great. Let me just. Okay, so firstly, a quick introduction to my grandfather. So as I mentioned, Bernard Sandler was born nearly 100 years ago in the 18th of October, 1922. He grew up with his brother Max and his sister Sonia, pictured here. He had a very happy childhood growing up in Chapel Allerton. He attended Hare Hills Elementary School. He was bar mitzvah at the Francis Street Synagogue in 1935, and there was a reception afterwards at the Victory Hotel. He lived with his parents, Celia and Jaime, and his grandparents, Morris and Gittel Hurst. And here, this is a picture of Morris and Gittel Hurst outside their house at 91 Hare Hills Avenue. But the crux of the story that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about tonight was he went to Leeds Grammar School. And in August of 1939, when he was almost 17, a friend of his, pictured on the bottom left, Roy Simon, asked my grandfather, pictured on the top left, he asked him to join him on a school trip to Canada and the United States. This was August 1939, remember? The world was in a very precarious position. His parents, Jaime and Celia, pondered whether he should go on this trip. He needed to persuade them. He did need to persuade them, and they reluctantly said yes. It could not have been an easy decision, given the situation. There were 20 children from the north of England that went on this trip, including 2 from Leeds Grammar School. They had an amazing time. And just as they were coming to the end of their trip, it was 4th of September 1939, so almost 83 years ago to this day, Britain declared war, and it was decided that due to the dangers posed by U-boats, that Bernard would stay in the United States. And this thus began his adventure. 17-year-old Bernard had never been to London. Suddenly, he found himself living in New York City. This provincial boy from Northern England was now living in the cosmopolitan surroundings of New York. The art, the jazz, the theatre, the liberal social views, it all had a profound impact upon Bernard, and it shaped his future career in theatre production. And this, as I said, began his remarkable World War II adventure. And what makes his story unique is that Bernard was British and he ended up fighting for the United States Army. And therefore, the title of the book, it was The English GI. During the course of the war, Bernard was separated from his very close-knit family back in Leeds. And the photographs here picture the family who moved from Leeds to Ilkley. During their time in Ilkley during the war, the Jewish community in Leeds founded their own synagogue. Maurice Hurst, who was Bernard's grandfather, became the president of the synagogue. In this picture is his mother on the left, Celia Hurst, and there's father, Jaime Sandler with the bowler hat. And these are his cousins and his uncle, Henry Hurst. The separation was very, very deep. He missed his family greatly, but it was the making of him. So just a quick one. So how did my book come about? Like many people from his generation, Bernard, like many people from his generation who'd experienced the atrocities and the trauma of war, Bernard never spoke much about that period of his life. But in 1994, around the time of the 50th anniversary of D-Day, he decided that this was the time to share his story with the family, and he wrote his memoirs. There are a lot of commemorations these days, but I think that the 50th anniversary of D-Day was quite a key one, as the veterans of World War II were starting to enter their retirement. And if they were going to write down their stories, this was the time to do it. He printed a handful of copies, and they were read and appreciated, and they were left on, and ultimately the book was left on the bookshelf to gather dust. And this is the book that he wrote. And thankfully he did write it. A few years later, Bernard passed away in 1998 at the age of 75 after living a happy and fulfilled life. So why a graphic novel? Well, I'll go back to the beginning. My son Theo had a huge interest in World War II. All 4 of my children's great-grandfathers saw combat. 3 of them are in the British Army, and Bernard was in the US Army, and their great-grandmothers had interesting stories too. We are all still amazed by how perfectly ordinary people were called to do extraordinary things during the war. The kids were asking lots of questions about the lives and the war roles of their grandparents. So I dug out my grandfather's book and I reread his memoirs for the first time in 30 years. And upon rereading it, I thought to myself, this is a really good story. This could be a good film. Realistically, that wasn't going to happen, but I had an epiphany. I'm going to turn his memoir into a graphic novel, and I'm going to do it by 2022, by October 2022, to mark what would be his 100th birthday. Another bit of background, I am a big fan of comics and graphic novels. I think that they are accessible to a wider audience of both adults and children. A graphic novel is very much a different reading experience. Ultimately, it's a quicker one, and you could argue less daunting for some reluctant readers, particularly young adults. The reality was, if I was to produce a traditional book, it's a very competitive market. It would have been equally as fascinating, but I didn't see the demand for it. I just had this idea that this would be a very unique and novel way of retelling what was a fascinating story and worth pursuing. Essentially, it was a gut instinct idea. I thought, let's just go for it. And that's what began my journey in producing this book. So the first thing that I had to do was do a little bit of market research out there, and work out, are there any other graphic novels about World War II? And there's two I just want to bring to your attention. The first one on the right, Mouse. This is one of the most iconic books of the Holocaust, and it's an epic World War II book by the American cartoonist Art Spiegelman. It famously depicts Spiegelman interviewing his father about his experiences as a Polish Jew and Holocaust survivor. And it famously portrays Jews as mice, the Germans as cats, and the Poles as pigs. There was another book which was a bit more realistic in the art, called They Called Us Enemy. And that was written by George Takei. Takei is most famous for starring as Sulu in Star Trek. And in 2019, he wrote a fascinating graphic novel about his own experience during the Japanese internment by the US government after Pearl Harbor. So that gave me a bit of inspiration. I bought a number of other graphic novels, and I decided on the type of style that I wanted, which, as I said, was a fairly realistic style. Now, the next challenge was, how am I going to actually achieve this? I soon realized that despite my A grade in Art GCSE, I don't quite have the skills to draw the 300 frames required for the book. So I reached out through a website, and I was actually overwhelmed with interest. And I received an email from an artist in Massachusetts who said, I can help. Your project sounds absolutely fascinating. And I met Brian Bicknell from Massachusetts, and we developed a very good working relationship. Simply, I would research all the images online. I was quite passionate about me sketching out every single scene myself, so I knew how it should be conveyed. And then the artist or the illustrator, he would turn it into a reality. So an early decision that we had to think about was, what was my grandfather going to look like? As you saw in the picture earlier on, in the picture of him in 1937, he was wearing glasses. So we decided to use him wearing glasses throughout the book. It was quite an important decision. We're seeing the evolution of this young, innocent schoolboy coming of age and becoming a man, and becoming a soldier. The reality was, I wasn't sure whether he did wear glasses all the way through the year, all the way through his wartime. But for me, that wasn't important. In a graphic novel, the most important thing is to have consistency. It was almost as if I'd found an actor to play my grandfather in this book, and that was to be his character throughout the story. The next the next challenge, over the next few weeks, my role was director, producer, scriptwriter, all in one. I had the story in the book, of course, but then I had to work out how to convey the scenes and the narrative. There were very few photos of my grandfather's World War II experience, of course. In some ways, this was the funnest part of the challenge. As I said, I researched every single scene to find suitable images online so that my illustrator had what he needed, as the details for me were so important. The signs, the background, it all needed to be authentic. So early on, there is a scene where my grandfather is trying to meet up with his contacts in New York City. My grandfather was due to meet them at a Manhattan hotel. He didn't mention which hotel. I researched Manhattan hotels in 1939, and I found the grand lobby of the Algonquin Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. I started to draw out the scene. This is my very basic sketches, but it just gave me an idea of what I wanted it to look like. And then what Brian would do is he would turn that into a reality. It was actually quite an amazing feeling as I went all the way through the book. It was almost as though I was reliving Bernard's journey by drawing out each scene. After that, my grandfather went on the New York subway for the first time in 1939. And again, I researched what the journey may have been like. An early scene that was quite important was Rosh Hashanah, 1939. A lonely Bernard is all by himself, and he feels a need to go to shul on Rosh Hashanah. He's alone in Manhattan, and he actually doesn't have a particularly friendly experience from what he recalls from his childhood growing up in Leeds. He was actually asked to move seat by someone, even though he'd paid for his seat. I didn't know which shul, again, so I used the Park Avenue Synagogue with its beautiful facade on the Upper East Side of New York, having found pictures of the outside and the inside. And I made these decisions constantly throughout the book. And for me, this was a hugely enjoyable part of the research of the book. So on to some of the people. Now, one of the most curious stories is Bernard was all alone in New York in 1939. His parents, Jaime and Celia Sandler, went to New York in 1938 to the World's Fair, and they'd met up with a couple called Fanny and Jack Efron. And they had an acquaintanceship. They'd met on holiday, and Fanny and Jack Efron were going to take Bernard around New York for a day's sightseeing on the 4th of September 1939, and they ended up putting him up and hosting him for 2.5 years. What a, it's such an extraordinary act. Now, this couple, Fanny and Jack Efron, were in their early 40s. They had a young son, David. They were very my grandfather was very complimentary about them in the book. They were very left-wing. They were atheists. We didn't know too much more about them. And you just have, when you embark on these projects, you just have curiosity. Maybe I can find their son. He was 3 years old in 1937. I asked my father, Michael, and my aunt Judy. They said they hadn't heard of this family in 80 years and they'd never really met them. So something had happened. So could I find them? This was the start of my project. So they had a young son called David. I did some, I'm no historian, but I did some very amateur Googling. David Efron, 1937. Let's see what I can find. And I found someone in Scottsdale, Arizona. I thought that's going to be pretty easy. I mean, there's quite a few David Efrons, but maybe this is the one. And there was an email. So I sent him an email on the first Saturday, on a Saturday evening when I started this project. And I thought, well, here we go. Grandson of Bernard Sandler. Surely it wasn't going to be that easy. Do you think he would remember my grandfather? He was only 3 at the time. I woke up the next morning, I checked my email, and there was an email, and it's in the inbox, it said David Efron. I was excited. A key person in my grandfather's memoir had emailed me. Hello, Jonathan. Happy to hear from you. I'm sorry to say I'm not the same David Efron. I was very disappointed. He did say, though, that his parents were from New York and they would have happily have taken my grandfather in, but he couldn't really help me. And that was what happens when you do research is, as you go down a lot of blind alleys. The Ephron family were Jewish. They weren't practicing. They seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. My assumption was the individual probably would have married out, and I sort of gave up. I tried a bit. And about 6 months later, I found a Sarah Efrat Ephron, an acclaimed Israeli professor in Chicago. And there was some link to a David Ephron. So I sent her an email. I said, it's a long shot, but are you a relative of David Ephron, son of Fanny and Jack Ephron? And I've got this great story. And she responded to my email 5 minutes later saying, yes, I am the wife of the late David Ephron. Her husband had died in 2017, age 79. I'd missed him by a few years. She knew nothing of the story of my grandfather. She said that it didn't surprise her that her in-laws had taken them in. That's the type of people they were. I shared with them all the photos I had. It was only one way. There was nothing back. It turned out that David Ephron, even though he had atheist parents, he ended up moving to Israel in the 1960s, and he ended up living on a kibbutz, and they ended up living in Chicago and an active part of the Jewish community there to this day. My grandfather had a friend in the army called Sig Gruberger. Again, this is a picture of my grandfather and two of his friends, and it gets drawn out in the book. Now, Sig Gruberger is written about in the book, and there's a very amusing story, but I'll leave that for those that read the book. And I wanted to get in touch with him. Again, my father and aunt had not heard of anything about the Grubergers in many, many years. I found a yahrzeit notice from a shul in New Rochelle, just outside of New York City. So I contacted the shul and I emailed one of the rabbis, said, could you help me? I have this amazing story. And I received an emotional email from the daughter of Sig Gruberger a few hours later. She said that her father had died in 1986, almost 40 years ago. She had very little information about his war years, almost nothing. But the one thing she remembered was that her father always talked about an Englishman called Bernard. And so therefore, it was really quite poignant that I'd been in touch with her. We ended up having a Zoom call. And as I said, I was able to share the information. There was nothing much that was able to enhance the book. So moving on, the key part of the book is his time as a soldier in the US Army. There are many ups and downs in this journey, as if you read the book. For the most part, what is quite interesting is for the most part of 1943, he was on a military training program instituted by the Army. Now, this program was for a select group of people. Well, 100,000 US soldiers were enrolled onto it, but it wasn't everyone. And he was quite privileged to be on it. The same program included the likes of Mel Brooks, Bob Dole, the former US Senator and presidential candidate, and Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. They were also on the program. Bernard was sent all over the United States. He worked hard, he played hard, he had a great time. He was away from the horrors of Europe, North Africa, the Pacific. And honestly, I don't think they thought they were going to be fighting in World War II. But suddenly, overnight, in February 1944, this program was disbanded and he was sent, called up back for training, and ultimately ended up in combat. And what was interesting was there was numerous memoirs that I had found from people in the same division, and they all came up with the same story of this sudden decision in February of 1944. So he does go to war, and on the 27th of August 1944, Bernard is part of a convoy of 100 ships that left New York Harbor. They set sail for France to fight and hopefully win the war. He served in combat in the autumn of 1944 in a campaign called the Lorraine Campaign. He provided a lot of details in his book, but there were gaps. and I stumbled across memoir after memoir of soldiers that served at the same time, which was a really fascinating experience for me. I'd love to have discussed these memoirs with him. One of the other major discoveries was there was a soldier called Victor Lundy. Victor Lundy became a notable architect, a modernist architect after the war. He's still alive today. He's 99 years old. He lives in Dallas. He created hundreds of evocative sketches of life at war. And a few years ago, there was quite a lot of press coverage because he donated his sketchbook and his drawings to the Library of Congress. And as I mentioned earlier, my grandfather was part of a convoy of 100 ships that left New York Harbor. And it must have been quite a spectacle. There were no photographs of this. So these sketches became far more important to me. And it was a great source of inspiration for me and the illustrator. And as you can see here, this one sketch, this was the day before they departed, 10 minutes from home. I used it a couple of times in the book. I use it actually for the front cover. I was so taken by it. And I'll just show you a few more examples of how in the book I used these sketches just to help give some context. This is them arriving in France in September 1944. So the research went on, and I then discovered that there was a Jewish soldier, Benjamin Kaplow. Now, Benjamin Kaplow died in 2011. His wife, Rosalind, found a stash of letters in the loft after he died. She read the letters, and they were donated to the Jewish Military Museum in Washington, and they're now published online. And one of these letters, Benjamin Kaplow vividly talks about Rosh Hashanah in September 1944. Benjamin Kaplow was in the same unit as my grandfather. Now, my grandfather, Bernard, didn't mention in his memoir about Rosh Hashanah 1944, but I thought that this was far too big a detail to leave out of the book. So I took a little bit of artistic license in some scenes by using this. In another example of this, I found another memoir by someone Jewish, Robert Kotlowitz. Robert Kotlowitz became an acclaimed journalist for the New York Times after the war. He wrote a memoir in 1999. And in one of his excerpts, he refers to his anxieties about having an H for Hebrew on his dog tags. Again, Kotlowitz was in the same unit as my grandfather. He was really concerned about what would happen to him if he was captured by the German army. Now, I don't know whether Bernard had an H on his dog tags. I suspect he probably did have. Some Jewish servicemen debated whether to declare themselves as Jews for this purpose, or whether to use C for Catholic, P for Protestant. Those are the three options. Some Jewish servicemen one thing they were told is not to get rid of your dog tags, because if you didn't have a dog tag, you would be in jeopardy of being accused of a spy. So the other important story I had to get across in the book, when I set out to do it, I really wanted to concentrate on 1939 to 1945. But my cousin and Bernard's nephew, Philip Van, who was instrumental in helping me with the background history of the book, he felt very strongly that our Latvian heritage was an important part of the story. Now, on the screen is Jaime Sandler. Jaime Sandler, Bernard's father, he came from Ludza in Latvia. He arrived in England, he arrived in Hull, aged in 1910, aged 17. He spoke no English and he settled in quickly. It was a great story of assimilation. Jaime Sandler was a very well-known person in the Leeds Jewish community. He was a keen golfer at Allerton Golf Club, season ticket holder at Ellen Road. Jaime was an extraordinary man, and this is a wonderful story of assimilation. However, he had what couldn't have been an easy war. But just take you to a few years before the war. In 1937, Jaime decided that it was time to go back and visit Latvia. And he took Bernard with him on a trip. And it was a trip that I had to make sure that I captured in the book. It was such a risky and frightening journey because they stop off in Nazi Germany along the way. And in this book, there's a very emotional visit to the Leeds Synagogue. And again, I researched and I found the Leeds Synagogue, pictures of it online. And they've actually restored this synagogue very recently in Latvia. It looks beautiful. And it was an important scene that I had to have in the book. Now, but when Jaime was on this trip, he was by that time a successful businessman in Leeds, and he had his two brothers and his mother and their families back in Latvia. And he did his best to persuade them to come back with him to England. But they were very settled in Latvia, and they decided that they would be better off there. And we write about the fate of the family. These two photos are incredible pictures. This photo on the left is, this is Bernard's grandmother, Grandma Ray Sandler, with two of her grandsons and two of her granddaughters in 1937. Sadly, two of the grandchildren were killed in the Holocaust. Bernard's grandma Ray and the other two grandchildren, they managed to escape, or they were exiled to Siberia. And remarkably, they survived. Now, I think I've made a mistake here because I haven't got the picture of them afterwards. But in the book, there is a picture of Grandma Ray at the end of the war, and you see how much she has aged. But it is absolutely incredible that she survived this exile to Siberia. And Bernard's Grandma Ray lived to the age of 79, which is quite remarkable, really, given the war experience. Bernard's two brothers, Bernard's two uncles were killed in the Red Army. So there was quite varied and extraordinary circumstances, and we write about that in the book. Now, another important part is there is also romance in the book. During Bernard arrives in New York as a young, innocent schoolboy, but he goes to New York University. He meets Toby Barish. It takes them a while to start going out with each other. And they shared a mutual love of the theatre. And Bernard really discovers the arts and the theatre together with Bernard during that period. What a time to have been in New York in that 1940s period. And at the end of the story, Bernard and Toby marry in New York. And ultimately, this is a very happy story. In 1945, they got married in New York, but they still managed to have an article written about them in the Yorkshire Evening Post, which was obviously, it was such an incredible story. And that's why it was quite poignant that a couple of months ago, when the book came out, the Yorkshire Post ran a feature about the same story 80 years onwards. So it's nice to have those two stories side by side. So Bernard Sandler, he became a successful businessman, but his real passion in life was the theatre. And he founded the Leeds Playhouse in 1970. And that was one of his big legacies. The Leeds Playhouse became the West Yorkshire Playhouse and has now returned to becoming the Leeds Playhouse again. And Bernard was involved in the Tricycle Theatre in London, and he was also an independent theatre producer. He was a really a huge family man, and that was, you know, people ask me, why did he come back to Leeds in 1946? He lived in probably one of the most exciting cities in the world, but he had this really strong relationship, particularly with his parents, Jaime and Celia, and his aunts, Henry and Leah Hurst. And these four individuals had set up a business that was well known in Leeds called Hurst and Sandler. They had many shops, and Bernard came back to Leeds to help run that business and develop it through to its eventual sale in the early 70s. But this huge, whilst it was a successful business, the most important thing was the successful relationship between the two families. They were really quite a team together. And then just to finally, just to end this presentation, said Bernard was a family man, but the matriarch of the family was Celia Sandler. This is a picture of her on her 90th birthday in 1988. And this is with all of her children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And yeah, I think just to finish up on, I think just a bit of reflection, I got to really get to know my grandfather all over again. And he lived a very happy and successful life. And I'm just so delighted that I've had the opportunity not only to relive his life, but to retell the story to a wider audience. So I'm just now going to open up the floor.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was really fascinating. I have read the book, highly recommend it. It's really, really, I suppose, with the illustrations as well as the text, really sort of takes you to the various locations that you've described, and really brings you into the emotions of the narrative. If you have questions for Jonathan, please put them into the Q&A in the next few minutes. While your grandfather was in New York, was he able to keep in touch with his parents at all? Were they able to communicate with him?
So again, that was a question that I asked myself, and I was quite curious. So they wrote letters to each other, but they weren't entirely sure whether those letters would arrive back because of the threat of U-boats. So I think they wrote letters, some of them arrived and some of them didn't. But he was very much aware. They did have the means of a telegram. So whilst clearly they didn't have email or any of the niceties that we have today, he did know that his family were okay. But I think, and that he knew that they had moved from their home in Chapel Allerton to Ilkley. But yeah, I don't think communication was particularly regular, and they certainly didn't have any phone communication. It was actually a question I'd asked on Quora.com. I said, was it actually possible to have a phone call from the United States to Great Britain during World War II? And somebody who was an expert in that matter said it would actually have been impossible to have done that during this time, which was quite interesting.
Now, you mentioned Bernard coming back to Leeds, and you're surprised to some extent that he didn't stay in New York. Obviously, he knew Leeds well, but how did his new wife, as a native New Yorker, deal with the sort of change of pace and I suppose total difference of living in Leeds to having been brought up in New York?
Well, I'm probably not best placed to answer that question, but all I can say is she wanted an adventure. She was a free spirit. She was close to her family in New York was probably a little bit smaller than Bernard's family, and she went along for the ride. They set up a very happy home. Very early on, they had their 2 children, and I think they took regular trips back to the United States to visit the family there. But all in all, I think she took it on as a challenge, and from all that I know, she really enjoyed her life in Leeds. Although when my grandfather sold his business, they did spend a lot more time in London, just because she was very much a fan of the arts, and there was probably more out there for
her. We have a question from Yvonne Cheney. Yvonne is one of our regular viewers in Southern California. She says, was Bernard made an American citizen as a result of serving in the US forces, thus having dual citizenship, even though he returned to the UK?
Yes, it's a good question. And I think there were a lot of people in this situation that had come from Europe and ended up in the US Army. There was a lot less bureaucracy. But what they did make a decision. He was given a tap on the shoulder, which is in the book, that he needed to go to the local courthouse and swear his allegiance to the United States. And so long as he was loyal to his country, he became a US citizen, and he kept that citizenship. And indeed, my father became a US citizen as a result of that as well.
Now, you showed the building that your family constructed for their business. Is that still standing? Is it still something that's owned by the family?
No, with the building in Regent Street, the factory. I don't believe that's still standing, but I wouldn't necessarily know the answer to it. I'd probably someone of your. I think, but it certainly, the business was sold many years ago. But no, I wouldn't know that.
What about the friend that he travelled with? What became of him?
So it's a good question. So Roy Simon is a member of the Jewish community, and my father is very good friends with his nephew. And again, that was one of my questions. When I was writing the book, what on earth happened to all the other people? Well, here's a good lead. We know the name. And didn't take much for a bit of Jewish geography. I got in touch with Roy's 3 children, and I relayed the story. And they said, oh, yeah, we did hear something about Roy going to the United States and Canada in 1939. But we didn't really know much about it. And what had happened is it would appear that he came back. He ended up fighting in the British Army in Sri Lanka, and he had a very different life as a result. So one of the sort of outstanding questions I've got, and hopefully one day I'll get the answer, is what happened to the other 20 individuals who were on that trip? I haven't got to the bottom of it, so hopefully one day I might find out. I think there were 3 other boys that stayed behind. Roy wasn't one of them. And again, yes, I'd love to know what happened to them. And it's interesting, his parents decided that it was too risky for him to come back to Great Britain during the war. I suppose there was 2 risks. One, that he might get sunk, his boat might get sunk on the way home. And the second is, it was a risky time to be in Britain. The Battle of Britain was coming, etc. But that, unfortunately, there was a horrific story in 1940 when a group of children were being evacuated from Britain to the United States, and the boat got sunk. So I think they had legitimate concerns. So they were proven right in that risk.
It's been pointed out to us by Malcolm Berwin and Judy Rivlin that the building in Regent Street is still standing. So might be something to have a look at next time you're in.
Next time I'm in Leeds.
You're in Leeds. So you say everybody has a book in them, and you've produced a book. What about another book? Do you think you might do this again, or do something else similar or different?
Yes, I mean, when I started out doing this, it was partly, I'll be honest, one, I wanted to honor my grandfather, but at the same time, I quite fancied doing a book. I had been on a I'd been on a graphic novel course a few years before, as a bit of fun. I was never intending to write it. And I think the two thoughts just, well, I want to write a book at some point. It might happen at some point in the next 20 years. And then I picked up Bernard's story and the two things collided. Now I've done it and I've been through the process. I would love to do another one. Probably not for many years. I think I went in this with a lovely bit of naivety. When you start doing a book, writing a book when you've never done it before, you can just enjoy the process. And I said, whatever happens in this project, I just want to enjoy it. And we'll see whatever comes of it comes of it. If I did it again, it would be a very different process, because I know now the full end-to-end of what is needed to produce a book.
And presumably it's quite an expensive process if you've got artists retained.
It is an expensive process, and you make mistakes and you learn from those mistakes. And of course, if I did it again, you would probably find a more efficient way to do it. But,
we have a question from Alan Mann. He asks if your father came across any of the concentration camps or confronted them in his army activity.
He had in his experience, he didn't. He was quite separated from that. And this is a little bit of an aside, I do mention it in the book, there is a very famous story about 982 Holocaust survivors that were escaped from Europe, and they were sponsored by the US government, and they were let in by Roosevelt. And they were the only and I remember the number quite specifically, 982 of them. And they went on a boat called the USS Henry Gibbons. And many books have been written about it, and it was a very interesting story. Now, the relevance here is the USS Henry Gibbons arrived in New York a week before Bernard set off on the exact same ship. And it was amazing that Bernard would have had no idea about this amazing story, that literally history had happened on this boat. But I suppose that's sort of part of the nature of World War II. Round every corner is an incredible story.
Well, there are no more questions from our audience, and you've either answered all of mine already or I've asked you them. So thank you very much for being our guest this evening. If you'd like to buy Jonathan's book, there should be a link on the follow-up email we'll send you tomorrow. Buying the book is a good way to support Jonathan's work. Books available, I think, from various places. To say thank you, I'll send you a book of some of my photographs of Magen David Adom in action. I normally hold the book up, but I'm traveling light here, and I don't have a copy with me. But yeah, please do show everybody yours. I really would recommend it. It doesn't take an awful long time to read, but it really is worth making the time to do so. Now, a few words about our forthcoming programme before we leave you. Next week, we have Craig Sherman with us. He's an American writer with local family connections, and he and I will be discussing his book, No Good Deed, essential reading for any aspiring synagogue president, and probably anybody else involved in a shul in any capacity. Then on the 19th of September, the former MP Peter Bradley will be discussing his book, The Last Train, a remarkable journey from Germany to Latvia to Britain. We have many more amazing speakers coming up, so please do visit our website at millim.org.uk to book your tickets and sign up to our newsletter to make sure you don't miss out on anything. All our events are free, but you can make a small donation to help with the cost of putting on these events. Please see the link in the chat or visit our website. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Jonathan Sandler, once again. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Pleasure.
And looking forward to seeing you at a future event. Until then, good night from Haifa. Bye.
And just to remind everybody that for the first time, we're having a post-talk chat. So I've just put the code in, and the link is in the emails you've received and everything. So if you want to join us, log in a few moments. Okay. Thank you, Haifa. Thank you, London.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.